January 17, 1943, Guadalcanal. The rain had just stopped, leaving the airstrip slick and shining under a bruised Pacific sky. In the middle of the field, a battered Japanese bomber sat alone, its green paint scarred by bullet holes, its red Hinomaru faded and torn. The Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Allies as the Betty, was a rare prize. Captured nearly intact after a forced landing, its engines still warm, its crew gone or dead. A group of American pilots and ground crew circled the aircraft, boots squelching in the mud. They moved slowly, reverently, as if approaching a dangerous animal. Some peered into the cockpit. Others ran their hands along the thin aluminum skin. One stopped at the wing root, knelt, and tapped the metal with a knuckle. It sounded hollow, almost fragile. Another opened a maintenance hatch and stared, frowning at the exposed fuel tanks, gleaming, unarmored, and shockingly vulnerable. The men exchanged glances, a mix of disbelief and professional curiosity. Why would the Japanese build a bomber with its lifeblood so exposed? Why risk everything for speed and range, but leave the crew with so little protection? The questions hung in the humid air, unanswered. As the Americans began their careful examination, unaware that what they would find inside this Betty would change the way they saw their enemy and the war itself. The Pacific War, 1942. The world's largest ocean had become a battlefield. Its scattered islands transformed into stepping stones for two empires locked in a struggle for survival. After the shock of Pearl Harbor, the United States was still reeling, its fleet battered, its confidence shaken. But the tide was beginning to turn. In the skies above the Solomon Islands, a new kind of war was being fought, one where distance, endurance, and the will to press on mattered as much as firepower. Japan's early victories had been swift and brutal. Their aircraft carriers struck with precision. Their Zero fighters dominated the air, and their bombers, sleek, long-ranged, and relentless, became a symbol of Japanese reach. Among these, the Mitsubishi G4M, codenamed Betty by the Allies, stood out. It was the workhorse of the Imperial Japanese Navy's bomber force, designed to fly farther and faster than anything the Americans had expected. The Betty was a paradox. On paper, it was a marvel. Twin engines, a crew of 7, a bomb load that could threaten ships and airfields hundreds of miles from base. Its range was legendary, over 3,000 miles on a single tank, enough to strike deep into enemy territory and return. Japanese planners saw it as the perfect tool for island-hopping campaigns, for harassing Allied convoys, for supporting invasions from the Philippines to New Guinea. But the war was changing. By late 1942, the Americans had dug in at Guadalcanal, determined to hold Henderson Field at any cost. The Japanese, desperate to dislodge them, sent wave after wave of Betty bombers across the sea, escorted by nimble Zeros. The battles were fierce, the losses heavy. For every American ship damaged or sunk, a dozen Bettys fell in flames, their long white contrails ending in black smoke and fire. To the men on the ground, the Betty was both feared and pitied. Its silhouette was instantly recognizable: long, slender wings, a bulbous nose, and a tail that seemed to float above the jungle. When the air raid sirens wailed, Marines and Seabees would scan the sky for the telltale glint of sunlight on aluminum, the drone of engines growing louder. Sometimes the bombers made it through, dropping their deadly cargo and vanishing into the clouds. More often, they were met by American Wildcats and P-38s, their thin skins no match for 50-caliber bullets. The first time a Betty crash-landed on Guadalcanal, it was a sensation. The crew, if they survived, were captured or killed. The aircraft itself became a prize, dragged from the jungle, patched up, and studied by American engineers and pilots, eager to understand their enemy's secrets. What they found was both impressive and baffling. The Betty's design was a study in extremes. Every ounce of weight had been shaved away to maximize range. The fuselage was thin, almost delicate. The engines were powerful but temperamental, prone to overheating in the tropical heat. The armament was respectable, machine guns in the nose, tail, and waist. But the real surprise came when the Americans looked inside the wings and belly. There, gleaming in the dim light, were the fuel tanks, large, unprotected, and frighteningly exposed. No armor plate, no self-sealing lining, nothing to stop a single tracer round from turning the bomber into a flying torch. The Americans were stunned. They had lost men to these bombers, watched them drop torpedoes and bombs with deadly accuracy. But now, seeing the Betty up close, they realized its greatest strength. Its range was also its fatal flaw. The questions began immediately. Why would the Japanese risk so much for so little protection? Was it arrogance, desperation, or a different way of thinking about war? The answers would not come easily. But as the Americans examined the captured Betty, they began to see the outlines of a strategy and a mindset that would shape the air war over the Pacific for years to come. The Betty's story began years before the war, in the design offices of Mitsubishi in Nagoya. In the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy issued a bold requirement: a land-based bomber that could fly farther, faster, and carry more than any rival. The Pacific was vast, and Japan's ambitions stretched from Manchuria to the farthest islands of the South Seas. To project power across such distances, the Navy needed an aircraft that could reach targets beyond the horizon, without the luxury of forward bases or the risk of refueling at sea. Jiro Horikoshi, famed for the Zero fighter, and Kiro Honjo, the G4M's chief designer, faced a daunting challenge. Every kilogram mattered. Armor was heavy. Self-sealing fuel tanks were heavy. Even the smallest concessions to crew safety meant less range, less bomb load, less chance of striking the enemy first. The result was a bomber that was, in many ways, a marvel of engineering. The G4M could fly from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back, or from Formosa to the Philippines, without refueling. It could carry a torpedo or a full bomb load, and it could do so at speeds that rivaled many fighters of its day. But the price was steep. The Betty's skin was thin, just enough to hold the airframe together. The fuel tanks, massive and centrally located, were made of unprotected aluminum. There was no armor for the crew, no bulletproof glass, no redundancy in the control systems. The philosophy was clear: speed and range were the best defense. If the Betty could outrun or outdistance its enemies, it would survive. If not, it was expendable. This doctrine was not unique to the Betty. Japanese military thinking in the 1930s and early 1940s was shaped by a belief in the offensive spirit: daring, surprise, and the willingness to accept losses for decisive results. The same thinking that produced the Zero, with its unmatched agility and range but lack of armor, also shaped the Betty. Pilots and crews were expected to be aggressive, to press home attacks even in the face of danger, to value mission success over personal survival. For the Americans, this was both alien and unsettling. U.S. bombers like the B-17 and B-24 were flying fortresses, bristling with guns, armor, and self-sealing tanks. Their crews were trained to bring the plane home, to fight another day. When American engineers and pilots examined the captured Betty, they were struck by the stark contrast. The Japanese had built a thoroughbred, fast, long-legged, and deadly, but fragile. The Americans built workhorses, slower, heavier, but able to take punishment and keep flying. The first technical reports from Guadalcanal and other Pacific outposts were filled with astonishment. "The fuel tanks are completely unprotected," one engineer wrote. "A single incendiary round will ignite the entire wing." Pilots who had faced the Betty in combat now understood why so many Japanese bombers exploded in mid-air, why so few crews survived being hit. The Betty's reputation as a flying lighter was not just Allied propaganda, it was a grim reality. Yet, for all its flaws, the Betty was a formidable weapon in the early years of the war. Its range allowed the Japanese to strike at targets the Allies thought were safe. Its speed and agility, especially when escorted by Zeros, made it a difficult target for inexperienced pilots. The psychological impact was real. The wail of air raid sirens, the sudden appearance of bombers over distant islands, the knowledge that nowhere was truly out of reach. But as the war dragged on, the cost became clear. Losses mounted. Crews grew wary. The Betty's strengths, its reach, its speed, were no longer enough to offset its vulnerabilities. American pilots learned to aim for the wings, to fire incendiaries and tracers, to exploit the bomber's Achilles heel. Japanese commanders, faced with mounting casualties, began to question the wisdom of sacrificing so much for so little protection. The captured Betty on Guadalcanal became a symbol, a lesson in the trade-offs of war, in the choices that shape life and death in the air. For the Americans, it was a window into the enemy's mind, a chance to understand not just how the Japanese fought, but why. For the Japanese, it was a warning. The very qualities that had brought them early victories were now leading them to costly defeat. And as the Americans finished their examination, closing the hatches and stepping back into the rain, they carried with them more than just technical data. They carried a new respect for their adversaries' ingenuity and a sobering awareness of the price paid for every mile gained, every ounce saved, every risk taken in the name of victory. The Betty bomber was more than a machine. It was a crucible for the men who flew it, the men who fought it, and the men who tried to understand it. Each angle, human, tactical, technological, revealed a different truth about the war in the Pacific. The human angle was always the most immediate. For the Japanese crews, the G4M was both a source of pride and a sentence of fate. Pilots and gunners were handpicked, trained to believe in the mission above all else. They knew the risks. They saw the Betty's thin skin, felt the vibration of the engines, heard the stories of bombers that never returned. Yet they climbed aboard day after day, trusting in their skill, their luck, and the spirit of their comrades. Some wrote letters home before every mission, knowing each could be their last. Others carried family photos tucked into flight suits, silent reminders of what they fought for and what they might never see again. For the Americans, the Betty was a puzzle and a threat. Pilots who faced it in the air learned quickly to respect its speed and the discipline of its crews. The Betty's approach was often sudden, its bomb runs precise. But the Americans also learned its weakness. "Aim for the wings," one Marine ace told his squadron. "You hit the tanks, you light up the whole sky." The sight of a Betty going down in flames was both a relief and a horror. A victory tinged with the knowledge that 7 men had just vanished in a heartbeat. Tactically, the Betty was a weapon of reach. Japanese commanders used it to strike at Allied bases, convoys, and ships far beyond the front lines. The G4M's range allowed it to launch torpedo attacks at sea, to bomb airfields deep in enemy territory, to harass supply lines and slow the Allied advance. In the early months of the war, Betty's helped sink the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, an achievement that stunned the world and cemented the bomber's reputation. But the same qualities that made the Betty formidable also made it vulnerable. Without armor or self-sealing tanks, the bomber was at the mercy of enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. As the Allies improved their tactics and technology, Betty losses soared. Japanese crews began to call their aircraft hamaki, cigars, because of the way they burned when hit. The nickname was grim, but it spoke to a hard-earned realism among the men who flew them. The Betty's story was also a story of adaptation. Japanese crews learned to fly at night, to hug the waves, to use cloud cover and surprise. They developed new tactics, skip bombing, low-level torpedo runs, coordinated attacks with Zeros. But the cost was always high. Every mission was a gamble. Every return a small miracle. For the Americans, the Betty became a symbol of both danger and opportunity. Captured aircraft were studied, dissected, flown by test pilots who marveled at their range and cursed their fragility. Intelligence officers pored over maintenance manuals, radio codes, and crew rosters, searching for clues to the enemy's next move. The Betty's presence in the skies was a constant reminder that the war was far from over, that the enemy was still capable of striking where least expected. Yet, beneath the tactics and technology, the Betty was always a human story. It was the story of young men sent to fight in distant skies, of engineers who made impossible choices, of commanders who weighed lives against objectives. It was the story of fear and courage, of loss and endurance, of the thin line between victory and disaster. And as the Americans who examined the captured Betty on Guadalcanal looked into its empty cockpit, ran their hands over its battered wings, and stared at the unprotected fuel tanks, they understood that every decision, every bolt, every rivet, every ounce of weight, carried with it the hopes and the fates of those who flew. The technological angle of the Betty's story was as stark as the Pacific sun. The G4M's designers had made a series of radical choices, each one a gamble. The aircraft's structure was a marvel of lightweight engineering. Thin-gauge aluminum, minimal internal bracing, and a skin so delicate that even ground crew had to be careful not to dent it during maintenance. The result was a bomber that could fly farther than any of its contemporaries, but at a cost that would haunt its crews. The fuel tanks were the most controversial feature. In an era when self-sealing tanks were becoming standard in American and British bombers, the Betty's tanks were left bare, large, centrally located, and frighteningly exposed. The logic was simple. Every pound saved on protection was a pound gained in range. But in practice, it meant that a single incendiary round could turn the bomber into a fireball. American pilots quickly learned to exploit this flaw, and Japanese crews paid the price. Leadership decisions shaped every aspect of the Betty's fate. Japanese naval command, driven by the doctrine of offensive spirit and the need for reach, prioritized striking power over survivability. They believed that speed, surprise, and the willingness to accept losses would compensate for the lack of protection. This philosophy was not unique to the Betty. It was evident in the Zero fighter, in the tactics of the carrier air groups, and in the relentless push across the Pacific. But as the war dragged on, the cost of these choices became impossible to ignore. U.S. intelligence officers, meanwhile, were fascinated by the Betty's design. Reports from Guadalcanal and other battlefields were sent back to Washington and Pearl Harbor, where engineers and strategists pored over every detail. They noted the lack of armor, the placement of the fuel tanks, the simplicity of the control systems. Some admired the boldness of the design. Others shook their heads in disbelief. "It's a beautiful machine," one American test pilot wrote, "but it's a death trap." The moral and psychological angle was perhaps the most profound. For Japanese crews, flying the Betty was an act of faith and fatalism. They knew the risks. They saw the empty bunks in the barracks, heard the stories of friends who never returned. Yet they climbed aboard, mission after mission, driven by duty, by loyalty, by the hope that their sacrifice would matter. Some found meaning in the camaraderie of the crew, in the pride of serving their country. Others struggled with fear, with doubt, with the knowledge that their lives were being wagered on the altar of strategy. For the Americans, the Betty became a symbol of the enemy's resolve and of the terrible cost of war. Pilots who shot down Bettys often felt a pang of sorrow amid the triumph. They knew that inside every burning bomber were men not so different from themselves, young, brave, and caught in the machinery of history. The sight of a Betty exploding in midair was a reminder that victory was never clean, never easy, never without loss. The Betty's legacy was written in the skies over the Pacific, in the wreckage scattered across islands and atolls, in the memories of those who survived. It was a story of innovation and sacrifice, of brilliance and blindness, of the thin line between genius and folly. The lessons learned from the Betty would shape the future of air warfare, influencing the design of bombers and fighters for generations to come. And as the war ground on, the Betty's story was far from over. The next chapter would be written not in the design offices or the test fields, but in the crucible of battle, where every decision, every weakness, every act of courage would be tested in fire. August 1943, the Solomon Islands. The air was thick with heat and the distant rumble of engines. On the tarmac at Henderson Field, a group of American pilots and engineers gathered around the captured Betty bomber, their faces drawn with fatigue and curiosity. The aircraft had been dragged from the jungle just days before, its fuselage riddled with bullet holes, its wings scorched by fire. Yet, it was intact enough to offer answers that would change the way the Allies fought in the Pacific. The examination was methodical. Engineers crawled through the bomb bay, traced wiring along the fuselage, and measured the thickness of the skin. Pilots sat in the cockpit, hands on the controls, imagining what it must have felt like to fly into battle with so little between them and death. The focus, again and again, returned to the fuel tanks. They were massive, centrally located, and completely unprotected. No armor, no self-sealing lining, just thin aluminum, gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The realization hit hard. The Betty's legendary range, its ability to strike targets hundreds of miles away, came at a terrible price. Every mission was a gamble. Every hit to the wings or belly could ignite the tanks, turning the bomber into a funeral pyre. The Americans, who had lost ships and men to Betty attacks, now understood why so many of these bombers went down in flames, why so few Japanese crews survived being hit. The impact on air combat was immediate. U.S. pilots, already learning from experience, now had confirmation. The Betty was vulnerable, fatally so. Training manuals were updated. Aim for the wings, instructors told new pilots. Hit the tanks. Don't waste time on the fuselage. In the skies over the Solomons, Wildcats and P-38s began to hunt Bettys with ruthless efficiency, their .50 caliber rounds seeking out the bomber's Achilles heel. The effect was devastating. Japanese bomber losses soared. Missions that once returned with most of their crews now ended in disaster. Survivors spoke of the terror of seeing tracers streak toward the wings, of the sudden roar of fire, of the desperate scramble to escape a burning aircraft. Some made it out, parachuting into the sea or the jungle. Most did not. The Americans, for their part, felt a mix of triumph and sorrow. They respected the Betty's range, its speed, the courage of its crews, but they also knew that war was a contest of design as much as will. The Betty's flaw was not just a technical oversight, it was a window into the enemy's mind, a reflection of choices made in distant offices, of doctrines that valued reach over survival. Reports from the front lines poured in. Betty bombers are going down in flames at an alarming rate, one squadron leader wrote. Their crews are brave, but they don't stand a chance once we get on their tails. The Japanese, aware of the mounting losses, began to adapt. They flew at night, hugged the waves, used cloud cover and surprise. But the damage was done. The Betty's reputation as a flying lighter was now a grim reality, known to both sides. The moment of realization, when American pilots and engineers understood the full extent of the Betty's vulnerability, marked a turning point in the air war over the Pacific. It was no longer enough to admire the enemy's ingenuity or to fear their reach. The Allies had found the key to defeating one of Japan's most important weapons, and they would use it with relentless determination. Yet, even as the Bettys fell in greater numbers, the men who flew them did not falter. They pressed on, mission after mission, driven by duty, by hope, by the belief that their sacrifice would matter. The skies over the Solomons became a crucible, a place where technology, courage, and fate collided in fire and smoke. And as the Americans finished their examination of the captured bomber, stepping back into the blinding sunlight, they knew that the war had changed. The Betty's secret was out. The balance of power in the air was shifting. But the story was not yet over. The Japanese would respond, and the battle for the Pacific would enter a new and even more desperate phase. The Japanese response to the Betty's vulnerability was swift, but the options were limited. In Tokyo and Rabaul, engineers and commanders debated the future of their prized bomber. Some argued for retrofitting the G4M with armor and self-sealing tanks, but the realities of war, scarce resources, production pressures, and the need for range made such changes nearly impossible. The Betty's design was too tightly bound to its original purpose. To add protection would mean sacrificing the very qualities that made it valuable. Its reach, its speed, its ability to strike where the enemy least expected. Instead, Japanese tactics evolved. Betty crews began flying at night, using the cover of darkness to evade American fighters. They learned to approach targets at low altitude, skimming the waves to avoid radar and visual detection. Some missions were launched in poor weather, gambling that clouds and rain would shield them from interception. The Betty's role shifted too. No longer the spearhead of daylight raids, it became a tool for harassment, for desperate supply runs, for kamikaze attacks as the war turned against Japan. But the cost was relentless. Every new tactic brought new dangers. Night flights meant navigation errors and crashes. Low-level attacks exposed the bombers to anti-aircraft fire from ships and ground batteries. The crews, already stretched thin by losses, faced exhaustion and dwindling morale. Letters home became more somber, more fatalistic. "We do not expect to return," one pilot wrote in 1944, "but we will do our duty." The Allies, meanwhile, pressed their advantage. Intelligence from captured Bettys and interrogated prisoners was shared across the Pacific. U.S. pilots became experts at identifying the bomber's silhouette, at predicting its tactics, at exploiting its weaknesses. The phrase "Betty on fire" became common in after-action reports. The bomber's once-feared presence was now a signal to attack, to finish the job before it could drop its payload. The legacy of the Betty's design flaw extended beyond the battlefield. In the halls of Allied command, the lessons were clear. Range and speed were vital, but not at the expense of survivability. American bombers continued to evolve, adding armor, self-sealing tanks, and redundant systems. The B-29 Superfortress, which would later bring the war to Japan's doorstep, was a direct beneficiary of these hard-won insights. For the Japanese, the Betty became a symbol of both ingenuity and tragedy. It had served with distinction in the early years, sinking ships, striking airfields, and carrying Admiral Yamamoto on his final fatal flight. But as the war ground on, it became a flying coffin, a testament to the dangers of uncompromising doctrine. The crews who flew it were honored for their bravery, mourned for their losses, and remembered for their sacrifice. In the final months of the war, the Betty's role changed once more. With Japan's resources depleted and its airfields under constant attack, the bomber was pressed into service as a transport, a supply plane, even a kamikaze weapon. The same range that had once made it a terror now allowed it to reach distant islands with food, medicine, and reinforcements. But the risks remained. Many Bettys were lost to enemy fighters, to flak, to the unforgiving sea. The end came quietly. In August 1945, as Japan prepared to surrender, a formation of white-painted Betty bombers flew to Ishima to deliver the Japanese delegation for the formal ceasefire. The aircraft, stripped of weapons and marked with green crosses, landed under the watchful eyes of American soldiers. For a moment, the Betty was not a weapon, but a messenger of peace, a final, poignant chapter in its long and bloody story. The Americans who watched those bombers land remembered the first time they had examined a captured Betty. The shock of seeing its unprotected fuel tanks, the realization of what that meant for the men who flew it. The war had changed them all. The lessons of the Betty would linger, shaping the future of air combat, of engineering, of the very way nations thought about the cost of war. And as the last Bettys were scrapped or left to rust on forgotten airfields, their story became a warning, a reminder that every decision in war, every trade-off between offense and defense, every gamble on speed or range, is paid for in blood and fire. The end of the Betty's reign was written in numbers, numbers that told a story of ambition, sacrifice, and loss. By 1945, more than 2,400 Mitsubishi G4M bombers had been built. Of those, the vast majority never returned from their missions. In the skies over the Solomons, the Marianas, the Philippines, and Okinawa, Bettys fell in droves, their long white contrails ending in pillars of black smoke. For every ship they struck, for every airfield they bombed, the cost was measured. In crews lost, in families left waiting for news that never came. The statistics were grim. In the first year of the war, Bettys helped sink the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, shocked the Allies with their reach, and played a key role in the early Japanese advances. But as the Allies adapted, the losses mounted. By 1943, the average life expectancy of a Betty crew was measured in weeks, sometimes days. Squadrons that had once boasted of their exploits now struggled to fill their rosters. The nickname Hamaki, cigar, became a bitter joke, a symbol of the bomber's fate when hit. The impact on Japanese air strategy was profound. Commanders who had once relied on the Betty's range and speed were forced to reconsider. Newer bombers, like the Yokosuka P-1Y Francis, were introduced with better protection. But it was too late to change the course of the war. The Betty remained in service, pressed into roles for which it was never designed: night raids, supply drops, even kamikaze missions. Each new use was a testament to the aircraft's versatility, but also to the desperation of a nation running out of options. For the Americans, the Betty's vulnerability became a case study in the importance of survivability. Reports from the field were circulated among engineers and tacticians. Training manuals emphasized the lessons learned. Never sacrifice crew. Protection for range alone. Never underestimate the enemy's willingness to accept losses. The B-29, the B-24, and even the humble C-47 transport all benefited from these hard-won insights. Armor, self-sealing tanks, and redundant systems became standard, saving countless lives in the battles that followed. The psychological toll was just as real. Japanese crews, once proud of their aircraft's capabilities, grew wary. Letters home became more somber, more resigned. "We do not expect to return," one pilot wrote in 1944, "but we will do our duty." The sense of fatalism spread through the ranks, eroding morale and making each mission a test of courage as much as skill. The Allies, too, were changed. Pilots who had once feared the Betty now saw it as a target, a challenge, a symbol of the enemy's resolve and vulnerability. The sight of a Betty going down in flames was a reminder of the cost of war, of the thin line between victory and tragedy. Some pilots felt a pang of sorrow amid the triumph, knowing that inside every burning bomber were men not so different from themselves. The numbers told only part of the story. The real aftermath was written in the memories of those who survived, in the lessons passed down to future generations, in the quiet moments when veterans remembered friends lost and missions flown. The Betty's legacy was not just one of destruction, but of innovation, of courage, of the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. And as the war drew to a close, the last Bettys limped home, their paint scorched, their crews exhausted, their place in history secure. The world had changed, and so had the men who flew and fought in the shadow of the Betty. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Betty's story did not end. Across the Pacific, battered G4Ms sat abandoned on airfields from Rabaul to Okinawa. Their green paint faded, their red circles scarred by bullet holes and shrapnel. Some were cannibalized for parts, others left to rust in the tropical sun. A few, remarkably, survived intact, repainted in white with green crosses. They carried Japanese envoys to Hiroshima and Manila to arrange the terms of surrender. For a brief moment, the Betty was not a weapon, but a symbol of peace, its engines rumbling over a world desperate for an end to bloodshed. The fate of the Betty mirrored the fate of Japan's air power. The Imperial Navy's once proud bomber force was shattered, its squadrons decimated, its doctrine of offensive spirit and sacrifice left in ruins. The lessons of the Betty were studied by both victors and vanquished. In post-war Japan, engineers and historians debated the choices that had led to so much loss. Some defended the design as a product of necessity, a bold answer to the challenge of distance and limited resources. Others saw it as a tragic miscalculation, a warning against the dangers of uncompromising doctrine. For the Americans, the Betty became a fixture in museums and training manuals. Captured examples were flown, tested, and displayed. Their thin skins and exposed tanks, a permanent reminder of the trade-offs of war. Pilots who had faced the Betty in combat sometimes visited these relics, running their hands over the battered fuselage, remembering friends lost and missions survived. The Betty's story was told and retold, a cautionary tale for new generations of aviators and engineers. The human cost lingered longest. Japanese veterans who had flown the Betty gathered in small reunions, sharing memories of comrades and missions, of fear and pride, of the long flights over endless ocean. Some spoke of the terror of fire, of the desperate scramble to escape a burning aircraft, of the relief and guilt of survival. Others remembered the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the belief that their sacrifice would help secure Japan's future. For many, the Betty was both a source of pride and a symbol of loss, a reminder of youth, of hope, of a world that vanished in the flames of war. Historians, too, found meaning in the Betty's legacy. They saw in its story the eternal tension between innovation and risk, between the demands of strategy and the realities of combat. The Betty was a product of its time, shaped by the geography of the Pacific, the ambitions of the Imperial Navy, and the willingness of a nation to accept terrible losses for the promise of victory. Its fate was a lesson in humility, a reminder that even the boldest designs can be undone by a single fatal flaw. In the end, the Betty's legacy was not just one of destruction, but of endurance. It was a testament to the courage of those who flew it, the ingenuity of those who built it, and the hard lessons learned by those who fought against it. The Betty's story echoed in the design of future bombers, in the doctrines of air forces around the world, in the memories of a generation that had seen the sky set alight by war. And as the last Bettys faded into history, their story remained, a warning, a tribute, and a question for all who would build, fly, or fight in the unforgiving realm above the clouds. The story of the Betty bomber is a story of choices, of what to protect, what to risk, and what to sacrifice in the pursuit of victory. In the crucible of the Pacific War, every decision was magnified. The Betty's designers chose range over armor, speed over safety, believing that boldness and reach would win the day. For a time, they were right. The Betty struck fear into Allied fleets and outposts, its shadow stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. But war is a relentless teacher. The very qualities that made the Betty formidable became its undoing. The unprotected fuel tanks, the thin skin, the lack of armor, each was a gamble that, in the end, cost Japan dearly. The skies over the Pacific became a proving ground, and the Betty's fate was sealed not just by enemy bullets, but by the hard logic of survival. Yet, within that story of loss and destruction, there is also a story of courage. The men who flew the Betty knew the risks. They climbed aboard, mission after mission, driven by duty, by hope, by the bonds of their crew. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It forced their adversaries to adapt, to innovate, to respect the enemy's resolve even as they exploited his weakness. The Betty's legacy endures in the lessons it left behind. In every aircraft designed since, in every doctrine that weighs the balance between offense and defense, there is an echo of those choices made in a distant war. The Betty reminds us that technology is never neutral, that every innovation carries a cost, and that the true measure of a weapon is found not just in its victories, but in the lives it touches and the lessons it leaves. As the sun sets on the airfields of the Pacific, the Betty's silhouette lingers, a symbol of ambition, of tragedy, and of the enduring human spirit that soars even in the face of fire.